Okay, I think we're good to go. So hello, welcome everyone to this event with the lovely Rhea Ewing. We're going to be talking about their new graphic novel, Fine, a comic about gender. If at any point you have any questions for Rhea, feel free to put them into the chat. It's going to be, if you go to the Lighthouse website, there's a chat tab. You can put in a question. And at the end of the Q&A, you're going to have a chance to have those questions answered. So just to introduce myself very quickly, my name's Eve Greenwood. My pronouns are they, them. I am the person behind Quindry Press. We put out independent comics and graphic novels, and our most relevant comic is When I Was Me, Moments of Gender Euphoria, which was a trans anthology about joy and the euphoric experiences of trans people. But you're not here to listen to what I do. We're here to talk about Rhea Ewing. So Rhea is a comic illustrator and fine artist who graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a BFA in drawing and printmaking. They currently live in California, taking artistic inspiration from the state's diverse landscapes. Their pronouns are they, them, and they're here today. Welcome.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me, and for having me. I feel like for having me twice, since we had the first event and then we had to cancel it because I got the plague. So
yeah, I think we had you like half a time before, and then COVID got you.
Yeah.
And now we have for real.
Yes, I love it. I didn't love the COVID bit, but I really appreciate that I'm here and everyone's like patience and flexibility.
Yeah, awesome. Well, we're here to talk about your graphic novel, which is this beautiful. Oh, it's blurry. This one here. If I can get it, there we go.
Okay, here we go. I'll hold it up to you. Yeah.
Fine. So for people who haven't had the chance to pick it up yet, what is this graphic novel about?
So Fine is a nonfiction graphic novel based off of over 56 interviews that I did with people all over the United States about gender, what gender is, how it affects our lives, and how we can navigate it in a way that feels good for us and those around us. And I interviewed both transgender and cisgender people and people who weren't really sure how to identify with either of those terms. And the narrative through line throughout the book is my own story of coming out and kind of why I took on this massive project in the first place, and sort of how it evolved as I evolved with my identity and with what I was comfortable with. So that's the short little version.
Yeah. And there's so much that goes into this book. It's huge. Yeah, 300 pages. So it's got a lot of information in there and a lot of really interesting stuff. I loved reading it. It was like, I had a little cry. The first time I read it, I cried at the end. And then I reread it for questions and I had another cry. So enormous shout out to this book. I really liked it. So thank you for making it.
That's really meaningful for me to hear. Yeah, I started working on it in 2012. So it was about a 10-year process from starting the project to having it out and finally in people's hands. So a part of me kind of still doesn't believe that it's real, even though I'm like, I can literally hold it right now and talk to people about it. I'll often have to catch myself because I have to, I forget that I need to talk about working on it in the past tense now because it's done. Anyway, so after a decade of work, it's very, it's a big relief and very meaningful to know that it's connecting with people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's going to be, I'm sure you're going to hear all sorts of stories about everyone who's connecting with it in all sorts of different ways. Because, like you said, there's trans people, cis people, all sorts of people whose stories are being told through the book. And obviously it's a graphic novel. So where did your relationship with comics begin?
So I read Persepolis when I was in high school. And that and a few other books, Moss and Craig Thompson's Blankets, really brought into focus for me, like what comics as a medium can do, that it can convey very serious and impactful ideas in a very beautiful way and in a very accessible way. And what draws me to comics is that you have the literary information, you have the words on the page, but you also have all of this visual narrative information where you can see the characters or you can see the landscapes. And our brains process that in a slightly different way. It's a different kind of literacy is how I've seen some graphic novelists describe it. So when you have those two things working in tandem, you can convey a lot of dense information pretty quickly and a lot more easily than you can with just one or the other. So for example, with this book, like one of the things that I've been pleasantly surprised is how people in my life who have nothing to do with my work on gender or with my artwork, like have just picked it up and read it. And I think that if I had written like a 300-page like prose book, like exploring gender, I think it would have been a lot harder to convince people to pick it up. So there's a little bit of that, like, you know, you can kind of plug into it a little bit easier. So anyway, I realized what comics as a medium could do. And then I just started consuming as much as I could find of nonfiction comics in particular, where I was like, okay, science comics, I love that. Oh, here's a comic about like, you know, the story of evolution. All right, I love that. Here's like I also consumed a lot of like queer comics. I was a big fan and still am of Lillian Bydyke, which is a little, it's by a Canadian author. Erica Moen's work was also influential for me. This was partly how everyone figured out that I was queer before I did, because I had all of these comics that were like, girl fuck and gender is fake. And, and everyone was like, man, is there something you want to tell us? And I was like, no, I just like comics. Anyway, so I knew what comics as a medium could do. I was really interested in them. I love art. I love art's ability to make connections between different ideas. So tying comics into my questioning about gender seemed really intuitive to me. My original plan for this project was that I was just gonna interview about 12 people and make like a little 30-page zine. It would maybe take a summer, and then I would have gender totally figured out, and I wouldn't have to think about it ever again.
Of course, it's easy, very easy to do.
No problem, no problem. So obviously that did not happen, and that was a very humbling experience to go through. You know, I also think that this is the kind of project where I had to have that kind of naivete to start, because I think if I had realized the how gargantuan of a task that I was really taking on, I think I kind of would have gotten discouraged and not really tackled it. So, you know, there's something to be said for being a naive college student.
Honestly, absolutely. Yeah. I'm a webcomic artist, so I went into mine with the same thing where I'm like, I'll just do it however long it takes. And then 7 years later, you're like, oh my God. What did I commit?
Yes.
Yeah, awesome. I mean, comics seems like the perfect medium for something like this for all the reasons you said, like nonfiction especially. It's such a great way to digest all that information, make it so much more accessible to people who wouldn't really get this information any other way.
I think it also, sorry, I've just had one more thing to add there. So I think it also, within the context of gender specifically, I think the fact that I'm able to show all of my interviewees as comic characters rather than needing to describe them with prose, I think that really invites the viewer to think or to reflect on like the ways in which like we look for gender on a very like instinctual, as we're trained as like little kids, right, to like figure out who do you say miss to and who do you say sir to. So I kind of think that comics also bring up a unique opportunity in this case, where if I'm there's many people who I don't necessarily identify or label like what they are or how they identify. But the viewer can reflect on, and I hope maybe at some points also maybe be a little bit surprised by their assumptions based off of appearance.
Absolutely, and even like you don't draw all of the interviewers as they look either to request or like to protect their identity or something. And there's one interviewee, I'm sorry, interviewee who asked to be drawn as a superhero, which I thought was really fun.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting for a comic about gender as well, because it's not only how you are actually presenting, but also like how you want to be perceived. So drawing people how they want to be seen, or you know, drawing, like, gender is such a wide it covers so many parts of your life. And I think drawing this comic and interpreting the people, the characters, the interviewees in this really unique way is just so interesting and adds such a tasty little layer to the book as well.
Yeah. It was also kind of another unexpected challenge for me as an artist, is because I knew, you know, when you do a comic portrait, there's a certain level of caricature that, you know, you're exaggerating certain features and simplifying others. And I knew when I drew myself, like what I was comfortable with portraying and like what felt like, you know, like authentic and also like affirming to me. But for other people, that wasn't necessarily the same. So yeah, so even for folks who wanted a very straightforward portrait of themselves as they appear in the real world, there was often a lot of back and forth with participants, where I would want to make sure that I was focusing on the right features that they felt were important.
Yeah, brilliant. You did a great job. I mean, I wasn't in the book, but you did a great job.
Thank you.
Where did the title for the book come from? Fine.
Yeah, so I love the ways in which people can say a lot or say very little with like a phrase. So fine, you could say, like, if you ask someone how they're doing and they say, "Oh, I'm fine," you kind of wonder, like, "Oh, what's going on? Are you okay?" But fine could also mean like fine, looking at something in fine detail, or oh my goodness, did you see that cutie over there? They are fine. And I liked that, similar to how I felt about gender, you could kind of see the same thing or use the same word to express lots of different varying ideas. And so on the cover of the book, you know, you have all of the characters kind of like, this is a word bubble, and everyone is like, you know, saying it. And I like to think that, you know, each interviewee, it kind of comes across in a different way, where some people are like, "I'm fine, I don't want to talk about it," and other people are like, "Yeah, I'm fine, whatever, I don't like, no big deal," and other people are like, "Yeah, I'm fine, like, yeah."
Oh, I love that. That's fantastic. Yeah, that actually, like you said, relates to how people take different meaning for a single word. And so, you know, people who identify in a certain way, you can identify as masculine, feminine, and you kind of go into that in the book. Like, this is what femininity means to me, and it differs from person to person, which is so interesting. And a lot of your interviewees talked about how just deciding this word or this identity fits me helps them figure out their identity in a way. So like, oh, I like this word, I like the word non-binary, so I'm non-binary. Did that help you in your own personal journey? Was that freeing to hear, or was that did that make things more difficult?
Yes to both. So when I started this project, my goal had been that I would create basically like a single little chart or graph of like, this is what gender is, this is me, good, I figured it out, and now I'm done. So it was kind of frustrating at first as I talked to more and more people, and I couldn't find a coherent single explanation of like, what is masculinity, what is femininity. And also, like, since I had like a sense of what qualities I most wanted to cultivate in myself and express in myself. You know, I talk about wanting to be compassionate and passionate, logical, kind, all of those things together. Like, my hope had been that I would have this sort of like word cloud of traits, and then I would be able to look at the menu of masculine and feminine and go, ah, yes, that is me. So instead, to find out that I had it absolutely the opposite way around, where I was who I was, and the qualities that I embodied would be inherently tied to whatever gender I had. it was freeing, but it was also frustrating because I had wanted things to be very like contained and neat and I almost want to say like flat, like, and safe.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was frustrated to have that dream sort of dashed on the rocks of infinite possibility and all of the wonder that queerness can contain. And it was very freeing once I accepted that and realized like that actually opened up a lot of possibilities, and also kind of pointed me towards that I was asking a lot of the wrong questions about towards myself. It wasn't necessarily like, am I masculine or am I feminine? It was more, how do I want to move through the world, and how do I want other people to perceive and interact with me? And how do I relate to my body? All of that,
All of these fun questions are just so easy to answer.
Oh yeah.
And so when you were interviewing people, you chose to interview cisgender people as well as transgender people. Was that always the decision right from the get-go that you wanted to include answers? Because, when we think about the question of gender, in a lot of people's minds, it's only trans people who experience either dysphoria or gender euphoria. And it seems to be that only trans people worry about presenting as their gender. So did you always want to include thoughts from cis people, or did that come in later?
It was there from the beginning. And part of that was because when I started the project, I wasn't sure, like, am I transgender? Am I cisgender? Am I like some other category I don't know about yet? And from my perspective at the time, it was very obvious that everyone, regardless of how they identified and if they identified with what they were assigned at birth, we all interact with gender on like a very like almost constant daily basis, whether we realize it or not. And these are things we all grapple with. So I wanted to learn from as many people as I could. And I'm really glad that I approached it with that broad lens, because it really helped direct me towards some of my favorite interviewees. So for example, LaShawn, who is a Black woman, she identifies also as a Black geek, and her discussions of how her race and also her interests really like shaped her experience of gender was very enlightening for me. Another one of my favorite interviewees, Willow, identifies with what she was assigned at birth, and also like disability is like such a huge part of how she experiences gender and queerness, and how she finds home and community. So there was certainly like a moment partway through the project where I had some people ask me like, why are you talking to cisgender people about this? That I questioned it, and then I kind of came to the conclusion like, no, I really do want to have this like cohesive whole. And if you look at the political discourse about transgender existence now, it is often framed as like that trans people are the ones who have gender and have like interact with gender, and everyone else is just like, I don't know, doesn't have a gender. Right. Like it's really misleading, because of course like of course, like how, like we all know, like cisgender men who worry, like, are they masculine enough? Are they manly enough? Are you man enough? Like that's a phrase common in our culture. So, and one of the hopes that I have for the project, and also for queerness and gender equity in general, is that we can really challenge those ideas in a way that is like inclusive and like liberating for everyone, particularly, of course, the most marginalized of us.
Brilliant. Yeah, and so you mentioned LaShawn specifically identifying as like a Black woman or a Black geek. And you mentioned in the book how your research did snowball into these wider questions about the intersectionality of gender with race and disability privilege. At what point did you realize that this was going to be a way bigger project than you anticipated?
I think it was kind of a slow creeping realization that I had gotten myself into something much bigger than I had expected. That I kind of had, so my initial run at things, I interviewed about a dozen people, just of friends, family, friends of friends, anyone who really was willing to sit down and talk to me for a couple of hours. And then when I looked at what I had, I realized it was really incomplete. And so I talked to a few more people, and then I realized like, no, we're still not complete. So then I sat down and I made like kind of my dream list of like, to get the most comprehensive view of gender that I can. This is my ideal list of like, these are the demographics I would hit. This is who I would speak to. Like, it seems like there might be some conflicting opinions over here in this demographic. So maybe I would get to talk to both sides of that. I don't know. Like, I had like a pretty extensive, it was like over 100.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then I kind of hit some practical limitations. Practical limitations in terms of I self-funded the entire project. I initially did try applying for some grants to help cover costs for travel and to, you know, like I also had wanted to directly compensate my interviewees. And I was rejected for all of the everything that I applied for. Basically, the response was that I could get funding to actually print the book once it was done, but all of the work going into it in the run-in, I was kind of on my own. So that really put restrictions, right, on like, ideally, like I would be able to go out and meet people where they were physically, and talk to them and get to know them. Instead, I was driving. There's actually a map in the introduction of the book of the states where I drove around. I can hold that up. Well, no, I can't because I have this fancy background. Okay. Yeah, all right, Zoom. Anyway, in the introduction of the book, there's like a map of the places that I was able to actually physically drive to. And I drove that car into the ground. I put like tens of thousands of miles on my car. I had to like replace the brakes and do a lot of repair work on it myself. And I also did a lot of virtual interviews and a lot of cold emailing people who lived hundreds or thousands of miles away, just kind of hoping that they would like, you know, be willing to talk to me. And also, that kind of brings my other challenge with reaching as broad of a demographic as I wanted, which is trust. So I look the way that I do, a masculine presenting, female, assigned female at birth, white person. And there are there's a lot of distrust within the queer and trans community of like people who look like me, and that is unfortunately earned, because I found out as I was trying to reach out to some communities that there were people who had done exactly what I was doing, of saying that they wanted to interview people about gender and then twisted particularly trans women's words into a very trans misogynistic, transphobic rhetoric. So earning that trust, and of course, you know, also displaying that I would be willing to hear things like racism exists, and that I, you know, could actually center the voices of people of color. That was also like a point of trust. So building that took time and took connections. It took, you know, volunteering at organizations who then, once they got to know me well enough, felt comfortable introducing me to a group over here. And so obviously I interviewed 56 people. I had my ideal list of over 100. And the limitation that I ran into was purely practical of, the money that I would need to do this project the way I would ideally like to, I don't have it. The time I would need, I'm running out of time. The interviews I did at the beginning are already starting to feel like distant and like, you know, fading in relevance to the present moment. Like, I got to get this out here now. So at some point it kind of became a matter of, okay, like I'm going to gather everything up that I have and try to be really honest with my readers that this isn't the complete picture, and this is a conversation in progress. And, you know, I also hope that all of my readers feel like that is a conversation that they are actively contributing to and should actively contribute to. So anyway, that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but
it's
yeah.
and I think as well, it's like, even though you can try for 10 years to get this clear idea of gender across um, all sorts of contexts, you're still so limited in terms of just the sheer number of people who live in the world and experience gender every
Right.
single day.
Right. And fitting it all into a single book. Like there's actually the draft of the book that I originally pitched to my publisher was about 100 pages longer.
Oh, wow.
And I was asked to cut it down for readability, which I'm glad that I did, because I do think it flows a lot better now. And I think that while, you know, there's always more to add and more to say. So anyway, but yeah, so I just try to be as transparent about that as possible, that it's not a complete picture. Yeah.
I think it would be interesting as well, because you're I don't know the States very well, but you're limited geographically to like a section of America. Even if you were to take that research and do it, you know, in the UK or, you know, in anywhere across the globe, it would be interesting to think about how those answers would change, and how I think the restrictions sort of lend itself to this conversation about just how wide a topic this really is. Like,
yeah,
you're never going to have a complete picture. Although I do love, going back to what you said about the diagrams, I do love in the book when you talk about, I want my grid, almost like one of those online quizzes where it's like, what gender am I?
Yes, I actually remember taking a lot of those quizzes when I was a teenager and a young adult, and I actually I actually put a lot of like oomph into them. I was like, this will tell me, and then
Absolutely. I think almost
No.
all of us typed in "am I trans" into Google. Google will know.
Yes, Google will know. Yes.
So with all of this, like, with all of the stuff you had to do, all of the driving, the interviewing, and making those connections with the people you were interviewing, did this project ever feel like unconquerable, like you were never going to see the end of it?
Yeah, there were multiple times that it felt that way, and I have anxiety and depression, just as stuff that my neurochemistry just kind of throws at me sometimes. And that made it quite challenging as well, to realize that I had taken on such a massive task, to realize that in terms of my ideal version of this project would probably involve someone who is not me being the one asking all of these questions and kind of leading the conversation, right? Because I am relatively extremely privileged within the trans community, in terms of how I'm read by other people in the world, how I'm treated. I'm white. I was financially well off enough to take on this project, even though I could wish that it had been better, or it had been better funded. The fact that I had the resources to, and the luck to be able to, for example, live in my parents' basement for a few years. Like, not everyone has that. So acknowledging the truth that like my ideal version of this book would have been written by like a Black trans woman with a disability, and it would have been super well funded, and you know, given her the ability to live independently for like however long the project took. Like, that's my ideal version of it. But in the world that we live in, and for what this book is, like, this is what I have to engage with, and these are the tools that I have. The point where it got toughest was around 2018, 2019. And that was where I just kind of hit a point of exhaustion where no one but me had seen the entire manuscript. And I, realized that for my creative process, I really need to have kind of a back and forth, to know that other people care about this and are invested in it, or like benefiting from it in some way. So I gathered a group of 4 trusted friends and colleagues who knew books and knew gender, and kind of like, I really respected their opinions, like had academic degrees in gender. And I was like, here, come read my book. All I have are these like giant 3-ring binders with like scribbles and text, and I didn't photocopy a copy for everyone. So I just had like these 4 people sit around my dining room table for an afternoon and take turns reading through these giant binders. And I just sat there the whole time staring at them because I was too nervous to do anything else because I'd already been working on this for so long. And then the feedback that I got from them that I had done something actually important or impactful was so moving and really kind of gave me the boost that I needed to take it to the next step, which was then I realized, okay, I've kind of am so burnt out on this, and I know myself well enough now to know that I don't necessarily have the skills to be like, hey, everybody, look at this book, it's so awesome. Like, so I connected with my agent, and she was really instrumental in helping shape the narrative and encourage me to be as ambitious as I could with in terms of how many people the book could reach. And I also connected with artist Sally Scott and It's 19 Cats, who were my assistants and helped me with some of the inking of the pages. And that was really helpful for me as well, because even when I was my most depressed and anxious and like, this book won't do anything for anybody, I could at least say, yeah, and Sally is waiting on me to pay her to ink this page, so I gotta draw it. And that kind of helped get that little boost, which I think, kind of ties to the themes of the book nicely of like, we're in this together and we need other people more than we need like a perfect individual self.
Yeah, I think comics especially is such a lonely medium. It's for the most part you, and if you are the writer and the artist, it is just you all the way. So having that sense of community and having colleagues that you can lean back on and be like, okay, am I wasting my time? Am I making something good? Is so important. And I think more important in comics than a lot of other artistic fields. I love my colleagues, and I'm glad that you also they were able to lift you up out of that.
Yes.
You interviewed so many people, and there were a lot of really amazing things that people said during their interviews. I wrote down a whole bunch of quotes because I was like, that is just such an interesting way to think about it. I've never thought about gender like that before. Were there any answers you got that really took you off guard or made you uncomfortable, or that you found difficult to include in the book?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of one of the things that stood out to me early on was that a lot of my interviewees sort of contradict each other. And so like I was going to make a book that probably most people would read it and find at least one thing where they would be like, I don't know about that, right? Because the interviewees themselves are kind of disagreeing with each other at certain points or seeing things very differently. A few points that really stood out for me was in discussions of femininity. In the final draft of the book, the chapter on femininity, it actually turned out quite positive about what femininity can be, and I'm proud of that. And for me, especially early on in the project, when I was trying to figure out where I stood with things, I felt really uncomfortable sometimes when someone was like, "Oh, femininity means that I'm really nurturing and like I am part of this larger project of like holding the world with love and and companionship." And I felt really uncomfortable with that because of my own like gendered baggage of like, I don't know, like, why do you expect me to be that way? Like, what's going on? So it kind of, those early experiences though, I think were really helpful for me learning how to take a step back, and that like someone else's experience of gender didn't necessarily need to reflect anything on my own. And what was most important for me in those interviews was to listen and to hear everything that was being said, and to hold space for that. So, and then later I could go and process like, what might that mean for me, and how do I connect this to this larger narrative? Another thing that was not necessarily uncomfortable for me, but challenging in terms of figuring out how I wanted to present it. There's a interviewee, Paris, who talks about how Paris made the decision to detransition, primarily so that Paris could put more finances towards buying very nice, expensive designer things. Because that gender presentation of being like, the exact quote is a boss ass bitch, was more important than like having a particular hormone mix, which I think is so powerful and joyful and beautiful. And it was also something where sometimes I like felt nervous about including it, because I'm like, oh, like, will people read that and like assume, I don't know, that means something else about other trans people over here, like, and eventually, like, you know, now I'm at the point, it's one of my favorite interviews, both because Paris is such a character and such a wonderful storyteller, and also because, you know, it kind of does bring up that, yeah, we all interact with gender and our bodies, and sometimes that's not the most important thing to a person. Sometimes we just want to be really fancy.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Paris is, I think, maybe one of my top favorite interviews in the book. It is, I had to read that, those couple of pages out loud to my partner. I'd let you have to, this is fantastic. Yeah, I think it's really interesting thinking about how one person's either like word or definition of something can like contrast with your own, and kind of like there's that little bit of uncomfortableness there. And that's something that I think we're still feeling, obviously, in the queer community today. So the book brings up the idea of conforming within queer communities, not even within the wider world, by using like the right words, or the you know, excluding the wrong kinds, the right words, and excluding the wrong kinds of trans people. So were you surprised to hear about how these queer communities can enforce the same sort of strict rules, and or like restricting vocabulary to come across in a certain way? Was that something? How did you find that when you were doing your research?
I mean, honestly, I found it to be a big relief. And that's because my own experiences with trying to find and connect with queer community had been so negative up until that point. When I was in high school, I started questioning, like, am I bisexual? And I had friends who were queer who just flat out told me that no, I was not. I was a straight girl. And I was like, well, you seem like a qualified expert to me, fellow 15-year-old. So I guess this is what I am. You know, then later on in college, before I started the book, I had wanted to kind of figure gender out, because I kept, you know, having this, like, I really wanted to hang out with like the LGBTQ clubs on campus. And like, I wanted to like have this, I couldn't really relate to like the straight and cisgender people who I was trying to interact with. And so I was like, I want this community. And one of the requirements of being in that space was defining yourself in like, not necessarily in a particular way, but just like as like some kind of like queer, trans, whatever. And I felt like in order to be honest, like I didn't want to be an interloper, or to be to harm someone with my presence by accident. That was a real concern of mine, and still is, with much of the way that I think about, you know, what spaces am I in and how am I interacting with people. So I thought, like, okay, like I'll, you know, do some research, figure it out. I went on the internet. There was a lot of screaming on the parts of the internet that I happened to go to, and a lot of people like being pretty intense and saying some pretty intense things about, like, you know, if you identify this way, or if you don't feel this, then you couldn't possibly be trans, and the trans community is better off without you, or like just a lot of like really like toxic things that, you know, hooked into me and into kind of the vulnerabilities that I have with depression and anxiety, that like, okay, this is not for me. If I like engage with this, I'm going to wind up making things worse for people. I absolutely do not want that. I'll just be over here figuring stuff out. So once I actually started the project Refine, and as I connected with more queer community and started listening to other people's experiences of queer community, it was a relief to know that it wasn't that I was this strange outsider looking into a party where everyone else felt comfortable. It's more that we were all kind of trying to navigate this space and figure out how to create spaces that were welcoming for people, when we are all also like flawed, traumatized human beings who are facing down an incredible amount of outside marginalization, and like the stakes are really high. So like, it was a relief to know that I wasn't alone in those feelings. And it was also a relief to realize where a lot of these intercommunities tensions are coming from, and that the source of most of it is trauma and this kind of outside pressure. I think I describe it in the book even as like, it feels like we're in a pressure cooker sometimes. And that's where you get people like kind of turning on each other or being really particular about language because they're trying to push a certain narrative for political reasons. Anyway, so it didn't surprise me. It was a relief. And yeah,
no, brilliant. I have a few more questions. In about 5 minutes, we're going to open up to the Q&A. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, which is on the event page. I think there is a tab or there's some form of chat function. Pop your questions in there and we will have Rhea answer them. Until then, was there anything in the book that you either wanted to research or did end up finding in your research that you wanted to include, but you didn't have the space or the time?
There were a few pages of interviewees that I really wanted to include, but I had some interviewees choose to withdraw from the project for various reasons, mostly relating to personal safety or comfort level. So there's some of those pages where I think about and I kind of have this longing for them. In terms of content that I wish that I had succeeded in connecting with people, I really wish that I had connected with more American Indian and Indigenous tribes and like spoken with people from different tribes throughout America. I speak with Ignacio, who is Taino. So that's an Indigenous group in Puerto Rico. But of course, in America, there's hundreds of different like federally recognized tribal organizations. And then there's hundreds more that are not federally recognized and a lot of different like cultural variations between them. And one of my ambitions early on had been like, I had wanted to connect more with people from different Indian tribes in different areas. And I'm using the word Indian fully recognizing that's not politically neutral, but because that is a phrase that many of the Indigenous people who I've spoken with, that is the term that they prefer. So anyway, I wish that I had succeeded in connecting with more of those folks. In hindsight, I think that I've learned a lot since I started this project about how different cultural communication styles and relationship building. So my initial approach of like, hey, do you want to talk about gender? Would be really off-putting to a lot of people. And in the work that I have done since then, with projects that have involved American Indian folks, I can see how like a different approach would have been more successful. So again, in the ideal version of the book, there's like different like, Native American, Indigenous, like American Indian folks like disagreeing with each other, just how you see all of these other folks disagree. So anyway, yeah, that's kind of one piece that I'm like, if only.
Yeah, the perfect version of this book is like 1,000 pages long. It has yeah.
1,000 pages long. It came out in 2015. It's like everyone got $1,000 for participating. Like that's like the perfect version that I wish was out there. And I'm glad that I have that version in my mind, because something that I think about now with my career is how can I participate in and potentially help build structures that could make something like that happen for other people in the future. So you don't have to be a like super privileged person who can live in their parents' basement for years, like to make a comic book like this. So.
Absolutely. So sort of to wrap it up before we get into the Q&A, again, feel free to ask your questions. Who did you have in mind when you were making this book? Like, was there sort of the archetypical reader, or were you just like, I want to put this out there and whoever connects with it can?
I kind of switched back and forth a little bit. So the archetypical reader who I kept coming back to was my past self. So I grew up in a rural area in Western Kentucky, which is a fairly conservative state. And the town that I grew up in, people there considered the town culturally diverse because there were both Presbyterian and Baptist churches. Whoa. Yeah. So that was kind of like a weird place to be like a questioning queer kid. And having something like this, of being able to hear from a lot of different people's perspectives, like people who were outside of the small community, or even people who were within that small community saying things that they would never say in kind of the everyday interactions that I was seeing. I wanted to make something that would like reach that kid. And there also, of course, are things in the book that are like not for that kid, like particularly the chapter about queer community, like that brings in, perspectives that the person who I was at that point, like wouldn't necessarily appreciate, but are nonetheless important. So that's kind of where I think of a more general audience.
Brilliant. Okay, so we've got some questions. So Jim asks, how do you feel about comics as an art form being increasingly considered alongside prose works by literary prizes and other institutions, despite being a fundamentally different medium?
I mean, I would say mixed. I like that there is an increased recognition of the power behind comics as an art form and what it can do. I think, when you have these like respected literary prizes recognizing comics and graphic novels, it says like, hey, this is important. This has conveyed something artistically that is impactful and meaningful and, expertly done, and we want to recognize that. And there is also this tension, right? Like I call my book a graphic novel just because I think about that as like it's a long form comic. I've encountered people who get really upset at that phrase because they're like, it's not a novel, it's a memoir, it's a graphic memoir. And this is also kind of the point where like I don't really care that much about the categorization of my books. I'm like, whatever. But I think that part of that tension reflects comics as a medium maturing in our cultural lens. And there's some growing pains, right? So like an ideal world, like we would start to value the prizes and awards that are specifically for comics just as much as we look at things that are for literary works. And there wouldn't need to be this like, you have been legitimized by being recognized alongside this prose novel. And for the way that our culture currently operates, like I can see why things are flowing in that direction. So I don't know, I feel mixed about it. I think that it's generally a good thing, and is also kind of like maybe pushing us to challenge some of our existing categorizations of like prose and graphic novels, and dare I say queer it up a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, like you say, the growing pains of the comic like industry or art form being brought into the limelight is like, oh, this is a real literary art form. Should hopefully eventually also come with a bit of a pay rise for all those comic artists out there, because
that would be lovely.
A labor-intensive medium, and hopefully it'll be recognized as such. Stuart is asking, hi Rhea, loved the book. Wondering if you've noticed any difference in opinions towards gender between the UK and the US?
That's a really good question. I don't feel entirely qualified to speak to opinions towards gender in the UK, because while I have friends in the UK and I have visited briefly, got the plague there, lovely place, I don't like have that like everyday experience of like listening to people. Like I see articles, and of course, there's some like world famous TERFs over there, but my impression is that similar to the US, there's a lot of different pockets of opinion, and also similar to the US, when it comes to the more transphobic rhetoric, there's a lot of very visible, very vocal transphobes, and then kind of the general population opinion is much more reasonable, is my impression. Yeah, I think that it's because the US is such a big place and there's so many different like subcultures or cultures within the US, like oftentimes when I see something from the UK, whether it's something that I'm like, hell yeah, that's awesome, or like, whoa, what are you guys doing? I can almost like always like, because of just who I am and my experiences, like I almost always immediately like click that into, oh, this reminds me of like this awesome group of trans activists who I know in Cincinnati, Ohio, or like, oh, wow, that's really messed up and reminds me of growing up in Kentucky, like cool. Like, so I think, I don't know, I think that's as much as I can answer that question with any kind of coherence.
Yeah, I think the UK tends to sort of be very snooty when it comes to like negative attitudes towards gender or like trans folk in the US. Just because the UK is inherently kind of snooty about this kind of stuff. Whenever America messes anything up, all the UK is like, ha, but we're not doing so hot over here. So I would love more UK people to kind of notice what's going on in our country before looking at other people. We are certainly a country. Okay, I think we have one more question, which is on its way being typed. If Superheroine was to get her own spin-off comic book, what would the storyline be?
Oh, yes. Okay. All right. Immediately, I'm thinking of like a Captain Planet-esque like arc where like the supervillain is like industrial, like eco-destructive capitalist forces. And because like part of Superheroine's story is that she did work both for environmental activist work as a student, and then also now, or at least during the time of the interview, works for an LGBTQ organization. So here's my pitch. Superheroine, she gets her own arc. The supervillain is eco-destructive capitalism that also exhibits control over people through very strict gender expectations and like normative body expectations. And Superheroine and her team of gender justice heroes fight back against that by like, you know, probably taking apart some like lumber mills and encouraging more people of the town to like express themselves in a way that they feel comfortable and like question, you know, kind of the driving forces there. That would be my dream.
This is a very fleshed out pitch. This is this like your next book?
I've never thought about it before Stuart's question. And now as soon as it was asked, I'm just like, oh, yes, I need this in my life immediately. So maybe. I actually have a couple of books in progress next. So I don't want to add another one to the pile, but if anyone's looking for ideas, you can use that as a starting point. I would love to see it. So.
Amazing. Well, actually, that leads into a really good question. Where are you going from here? What are you working on next? Are you going to stay in nonfiction, or where are we headed?
Yeah, so I have two projects going on right now. One is fiction, and one is nonfiction. So the nonfiction graphic novel, I'm actually writing it with my spouse. And we want to tell the story of our journey to becoming parents. And also like kind of include some other folk stories of like how, what transgender families can look like. Both, you know, I think common culture kind of has the vision of you have like a nuclear heterosexual family and then there's the trans kid. And that's definitely a story. But then of course, like trans people, we have kids and we have families, and like, you know, in the case of like both my spouse and I, like we have relatives who are trans, and like, yeah, so that's a book that's probably one that's going to take a little while to make, because the heaviness of it, and also because my spouse and I, we succeeded, we have a baby. And the thing when you have a baby is it's very difficult to do long, engaged, focused work when you're also trying to take care of a 6-month-old. So that one's probably going to like be simmering and like similar to Find take a while. Hopefully not 10 years. We'll see. The other book that I'm working on is a young adult graphic novel, and it is about a small group of trans teenagers in Michigan saving a rare habitat from development. The habitat that they save is called the prairie fen, which is a unique habitat that because of the way the glaciers came down through the continental US, kind of formed a lot of unique landscapes. So prairie fens, like they need like that particular landscape and like really calcareous water. And they have the same biodiversity density, so like number of species per like little square meter, as like many rainforests.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So, and it's kind of it's this kind of thing that if you look at it from a distance, you're like, oh, that's a nice field over there. And you don't really think about it. But if you look closer, then there's a lot going on. So I'm very excited about that. And that I'm planning on getting like, that's currently in the works more because it's, yeah. Anyway, I'm very excited about it. And if you ever want to like have someone tell you about like this most endangered butterfly in the continental US and how it lives in these prairie fens and how it relates to queerness, like just that is absolutely something I'm excited to talk about anytime. So
brilliant. Oh my God, I'm excited for those. Awesome. Okay, well, we can kind of wrap up, I guess. If there are no more questions, thank you so much for flying to Scotland to talk to us and then flying home and talking to us.
Thank you so much for having me and for your patience while I did all of that.
Is there anywhere where people can go to learn more about gender or learn more about the book or anything that you would recommend?
So if you go to my books has a website, findcomic.com. And that has more information about the book, and it also has several resource pages with things like mental health resources, further reading, books that I recommend you check out that are not by me but are extremely awesome. And I try to update that on a semi-regular basis too. So yeah, that's what I'd recommend.
Brilliant. Yeah. And where can people find you on the internet?
I am on Instagram as Rhea.Ewing. I'm on Twitter as @FindComic, all one word. And I am also on Pillow Fort as Rhea Ewing and Tumblr, but I don't really update Tumblr except when it's like weird dog pictures. So,
okay. Thank you so much, Rhea. And thank you, everyone who came to chat.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to both of you, Eve and Rhea, for a fascinating event. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone at home for watching. And buy Fine. We've got signed copies in the shop. And buy When I Was Me, the collection of autobiographical comics, which Eve co-edited. Please, there are links on the event page for both of them. But yeah, thank you so